Greetings. In this video, I want to briefly take a look at the date for Christ's birth from the perspective of the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria. Now, as a preliminary note, when looking into what different sources say regarding the birth of Christ, it might be helpful to remember the statement of the 18th century Jesuit scholar, Father Antonio Maria Lupi. Non vi è mese nell'anno, ove forse si eccetui il luglio, che non abbia trovati partitanti, i quali lo proclamino per mese natalizio. Nonetheless, in this video, I want to look at specifically Clement of Alexandria, as in my personal experience, he's invoked quite a bit more than any other ancient source on this topic, at least amongst polemicists who wish to look for a patristic source against a winter birth for Christ. And the general understanding is that Clement said that Christ was born in the spring. So on your screen is an English translation of a portion from Book 1, Chapter 21 of the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria. And starting here, the relevant text reads as follows, quote, "There are those who have determined not only the year of our Lord's birth, but also the day. And they say that it took place in the 28th year of Augustus, in the 25th day of Pachon," end quote. Now, to elucidate that a bit, the month of Pachon is a month on the Egyptian calendar. It corresponds to the month currently called Pashons on the Coptic calendar, and it falls in the spring. So the 25th day of this month would fall around late May, roughly May 20th. In short, this portion of Clement Stromata is stating that Christ was born in the spring. It's stating it rather explicitly, or at least it's echoing an earlier source, which took that position. So now, the question becomes, do we stop here? Or might there be more that can be said from this text? Well, if you turn to the Catholic Encyclopedia's entry on Christmas, you'll notice that it briefly touches on this, stating the following, quote, Ideler, in the second volume of his Chronologie, thought they did this believing that the 9th month in which Christ was born was the 9th month of their own calendar, end quote. Now, that's sort of a tantalizing statement, but it's also very short. So it might be helpful to turn to the source which it was referencing, which again was it simply says the second volume of Ideler's Chronologie. And that's in reference to Ludwig Ideler's Handbuch der Mathematischen und Technischen Chronologie, or, and you'll forgive my pronunciation, I'm terrible with German, but nonetheless, that's his Handbook of Mathematical and Technical Chronology. And what you see on your screen here is from Volume 2, page 387, and the first footnote on that page. And again, I hope you'll forgive me, as I just alluded to, my familiarity with German is extremely weak, but nonetheless, here's my attempt at reading what the relevant text says in this footnote. It says, Der 25. Pachon ist vielleicht so entstanden. The 25th of Pachon was perhaps arrived at this way. Die ägyptischen Christen, dass sie hörten, dass Christus im 9. Monat, nämlich des jüdischen Jahres, geboren sei, dachten an den 9. des ihrigen. The Egyptian Christians, upon hearing that Christ was born in the 9th month, namely in the Jewish year, the jüdischen Jahres, thought it was in the 9th of their own. In other words, the argument here is that Christ was born on the 25th day of the 9th month of the Hebrew calendar, and the Egyptian Christians, seeing a reference simply to him being born on the 25th day of the 9th month, wrongly thought it meant that he was born in the 9th month of their own Egyptian calendar, hence why they arrive at Pachon. Now, I imagine that some might find that rather speculative, and more so, some might find it unconvincing. However, in an attempt to explore the plausibility of that line of reasoning, I'd like to turn to Book 5, Chapter 13 of the Apostolic Constitutions. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not claiming the Apostolic Constitutions were written before the Stromata of Clement of Alexandria. On the contrary, I'm fine with the position that the Apostolic Constitutions reached their final redaction well after the time of Clement. Nonetheless, I would propose that it's possible that the Apostolic Constitutions pulled together older traditions which predate the work of Clement. And with that in mind, consider the text highlighted at the top of your screen, which reads as follows, quote, "Observe the festival days, and the first of all, the birthday which you are to celebrate on the 25th of the 9th month," end quote. So what we have here is a tradition which places Christ's birth on the 25th day of the 9th month without immediately specifying the precise calendar. Now, you might notice towards the bottom of your screen that if one reads beyond that text into the next chapter, the text makes a reference to, quote, "the first month, which is Xanthicus," end quote. Now, Xanthicus was a month on the ancient Macedonian lunar solar calendar. It lined up with the month of Nisan, or Abib, on the Hebrew calendar. So if Xanthicus was the first month, then the 9th month being referred to would line up with the 9th month on the Hebrew calendar, Kislev, or Kislev as they say today. But one only makes that connection if they read that far ahead. And to be honest, earlier sources which were stating that Christ was born in the 9th month might not have included that reference to Xanthicus as the first month. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there were Christian traditions vaguely stating that Christ was born on the 25th day of the 9th month, and it is at least possible that such a tradition was floating around in the time of Clement of Alexandria. Therefore, the idea which was proposed by Ludwig Ideler is not so absurd after all. It is possible that one of these traditions was said that Christ was born on the 25th day of the 9th month was floating around, and then Egyptian Christians assumed, 9th month, and they picked the 9th month on their own calendar, which was in the time of Clement called Pachon, and today it's called Pachons, and they would wind up placing Christ's birth in the spring. Now, again, I understand if some of you feel that this remains rather speculative. So let's return to Clement Stromata. Note that a little bit above the portion that we looked at, one finds the following, quote, "From the birth of Christ, therefore, to the death of Commodus are in all 194 years, 1 month, 13 days, end quote. Now, I would propose that the text marked in blue contradicts the text marked in red. And, honestly, that need not be a major issue, as, I read this simply to mean that Clement was referencing multiple sources. And it's, there's no shame in a situation where his sources might take different views. But it is nonetheless the case that knowing that the Emperor Commodus died on the 31st of December puts this text in a different light. Now, permit me to attempt to explain it this way. Commodus died on the 31st of December. Now remember that Clement, or one of his sources, said that Christ was born 194 years, 1 month and 13 days before that point. Well, 13 days before the 31st of December is the 18th of December, and 1 month before the 18th of December is the 18th of November. So at first glance, we seem to have this source putting the birth of Christ in November, which does not fit with the Pachon reference, which put his birth in May. But it's also worth noting that this may have been according to a solar calendar which lacked leap years, and thus across 194 years, you would have a discrepancy of 48 days. This is because every 4 years would have gained a day, and 194 divided by 4 is 48 with a slight remainder. Well, if you add 48 days to the 18th of November, you're going to arrive around the 5th of January. Now, admittedly, that's a bit late for the 25th day of the 9th month of the Hebrew calendar, which is to say the start of Hanukkah, but it is still within the early winter, and it is far closer to the date to the winter date than it is to the Egyptian Pachon reference. So here's how I would reconcile these disparate points in Clement Stromata. Clement was employing different sources stating different things. However, the text dating Christ's birth relative to the death of Commodus put it in or just before winter, which seems to lend credence to the idea that the Pachon reference was rooted in an earlier source, which said the 9th month, but intended a different calendar. It did not intend the Egyptian solar calendar. Now, at this point, some might feel that if Clement's sources were at odds with each other, there's a temptation to just scrap appeals to Clement entirely. Now, I would say, to each their own. You can feel free to move ahead as you see fit. But it is nonetheless interesting that even in Clement's Stromata, one of his references to Christ's birth allows us to argue for it being in the winter. That seems to provide us with reason to think that there is yet another early reference to a winter birth for Christ. But beyond that, even the portion of Clement Stromata which explicitly places Christ's birth in the spring can be arguably treated as plausibly rooted in an earlier source, which likewise placed Christ's birth at Hanukkah, or at least in the winter. In short, the tradition that Christ was born in the winter, perhaps more specifically near the time of Hanukkah, remains reasonable, even when working with the often cited text from Clement Stromata. Food for thought. Now, there's a great deal more that could be said. Like, for example, there's an argument that the Stromata implies two different dates for the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then you can date Christ's death relative to that. And, one of those attempts to date the destruction of the temple relative to the death of Commodus leads credence to this idea of, use of dates relative to the death of Commodus in the Stromata being on a solar calendar which lacked leap years. But that is a longer argument, which would make this video much longer. So that's perhaps best saved for another time. So I'm going to close this video here, and we can delve into those other things in the comment section or a future video. But for now, I'll say that I hope you found this at least interesting and thought-provoking. As always, I invite any comments, questions, or criticisms, and God bless.